Welcome to our Sunday service. This topic is so special. It is so sweet, so precious. This idea of only invitation. That if it's true, it's inviting us. And in contrast, if it's demanding from us and insisting from us and aggressively saying, this is what you do, perhaps beware. This probably is not true. It's especially appropriate at this season, at this time, because just yesterday we celebrated the anniversary of Swami Kriyananda's discipleship to Paramhansa Yogananda. And that's why we have this lovely altar here that features Swamiji. Both of them, Paramhansa Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda, exemplified this approach. And they're working with disciples, with students especially. We can see that. Now, Swami says in the reading, God doesn't coerce. He doesn't demand. And we can see that the masters, Swami and Master, they never used force. They used a kind of power, but it was the power that comes through invitation. It was a power of creating an open space and allowing you to walk into it, to create an open space for you and then magnetize you to the degree you're willing to respond into that space, but not using force. The true teacher, one who knows truth, will always invite. Yogananda gave open choices to his students and his disciples. He never insisted that they stay with him if they decided to leave, or if they wanted to change and do something different than he suggested. Swami said sometimes that Mount Washington seemed like a hotel, as it had been in former years, with devotees coming and making a commitment and then leaving. And of course, Master would make suggestions to them, but in so many cases, off they would go. Even many of the disciples that worked with Swamiji and trained Swami and taught him, were there when Swami came to Master, left. Now, indeed, they didn't leave the path, they didn't even leave Master, but instead of staying there, several of them went off and founded their own works and drew some people to Master. But we just have to wonder, what would their lives have been like if they had accepted his invitation to stay there and be with him? The nature of Master's relationship with his disciples was gentle, was subtle. Now, sometimes disciples of his did feel that they had the riot act read to them, but Swami said, how could they think that was harsh when Yogananda was just being more direct, speaking in terms that they could understand and get the message, but still supporting them and welcoming them, calling them to their own highest good. He was always gentle with Swamiji too. When then Donald Walters, Swami Kriyananda, went to Master, started to live at Mount Washington, he was very focused before he arrived there on his mental abilities. We talked some about this last night. His idea was that he really needed to analyze something. He needed to understand all the ins and outs of it. And if you had an opinion or an idea that was different than his, he wasn't going to accept that unless you could defend it. In college, perhaps more than studying and being a serious student, he loved these debates and the arguments that the students would get into back and forth trying to make their point. So this is what Paramhansa Yogananda got, the raw material that he was to work with Swami. But he never said, lighten up, come on, don't use your mind so much. He didn't give those kind of directives and demands forcefully. One example of how he worked with him was when Swami and some of the other monks were out at 29 Palms, and Master had gone into town for some reason and just returned. Master came into the kitchen area, the common area there, and had the lights turned out. And they're sitting around, and Swami hears this rustling of this paper, little noise, and then pretty soon, sparks were flying out in the middle of the room, and Master was laughing. And then he had the lights turned on, and he held in his hand one of these little toy guns that shoot sparks, and it's a disc whirling around making noise. And then he put his hand into the bag and pulled out another little toy gun, shot it up into the air, and this little missile flew up toward the ceiling, and then down came a parachute with a little guy dangling from it. Master chuckled to himself and said, "What do you think, Walter?" That's what he called Swami. And Swami, trying to get into the spirit of things, said, why, they're fine, sir. But this was Master's way of inviting him to lighten up. And then he quoted from the Bible to Swami the passage about, "Suffer the little children, come to me." Because a childlike joyfulness is so representative of the kingdom of heaven, and Swami needed to expand in that direction. But what a delightful invitation Master used for him. Swamiji also used the method of invitation in his working with his students. You know, if you have a group as large at Ananda, and even back when Ananda was only Ananda Village up in the Sierra foothills, if you have a group that big, there are bound to be a few people who are not completely harmonious with the entire group. And we had some difficult people back there in the first decade. And in some cases, the entire community, except them, would have agreed that they were a difficult person. And people would come from Swami to Swami from time to time saying, you know, you really ought to talk to this person. You really should set them straight. It's too hard, and creating disharmony. And in some cases, the leadership would actually go to Swami, people like Jyotish, and say, really, something has to be done about this dear soul. So finally, Swami would relent, maybe invite them over for lunch or dinner, at least have them come over to his dome. And they would have a nice time together, and Swami would tell them how wonderfully they were doing and how wonderful it was they could be at Ananda, and then say farewell. And of course, this caused some frustration on the parts of others, but that was Swami's way. Tell the person what he's doing well. Let them know that they can expand, that they can move more into the light. Give them that support and that energy. If he was addressing a topic that he might have had a specific person or a couple of people in mind when he was using it in a Sunday sermon or in a class, if that person was sitting over here, Swami would be looking over here when he said, and now judgment. Judgment gets us nowhere. We really have to refrain from telling other people what to do and that you know what's best for them. And that person sitting over there could go, that's right. Judgment is a terrible idea. Insisting that other people follow what you think is right, well, that's awful. I wouldn't do anything like that. Thinking. But if Swami had been talking right to them, the reaction would much more likely have been, Well, I don't do that. I don't judge. I don't tell other people what to do. But by looking the other direction, he created an invitation for that person, allowed that person to agree with him and therefore be able to examine their own lives without being defensive. Swami just wouldn't push you. I think several of us, I know I, can look back on years with him and really wished, well, if he didn't want to push me, he should have been more clear. Because I didn't do what he wanted me to do. And of course, as you know, the lack of clarity wasn't on his side. It was on mine, but more than once I thought, if he had just made me do that, how much better my life would be. But not his way. And of course, it wouldn't have been successful anyway. If he had made me do it, I never would have come to the realization myself of my situation. I came from a fundamentalist evangelical background. Grew up in a church. My father was a pastor the first several years of my life, and then I continued until I graduated from college in that environment, because he went on and taught at one of the church's colleges. And I was a firm and fervent believer. But there was one thing that was very, very difficult for me, and that was witnessing. It was our job, if we were going to be a good Christian, to go out and, at least as I felt it often, make other people become Christians too. And I'm sure there were some people in some churches where they just hold it to invitation, but that was not really the way of our church. You needed to go out and insist that people needed to accept Jesus as their own personal Savior, or they were going to spend eternity in hell. And you needed to get that message across and let them know what the stakes were and how at risk they were. And then at least you could have a big sigh and feel good about yourself. Not that the church said that, but this is the way it felt. It felt to me. I remember going on my paper route on collections days. And there were all these sinners I was going collecting money from. And I wasn't witnessing to them. And what a turmoil that was for me, especially after we'd just had a youth group session on sharing the good news. So when I came to Ananda, I was very relieved that we were not proselytizers, that it was not going to be part of my job to go out and make sure that everybody else that I had contact with would follow this path. But at the end of about the first decade of Ananda's life, Swami said we were going to begin outreach, and we needed to go out into the world and tell others about this path and involve others. We needed to grow. We needed to spread this. And I did not welcome that invitation by Swami either. My old experience just really, it was an old samskar, a young samskar, this lifetime, but boy, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And it was very, very difficult for me to let myself be pulled into that endeavor starting down in San Francisco. But I'm happy to tell you that Swamiji still just invited. Even if he was up on the lectern, 2,000 people out in front of him, and he knew it was his goal to pull them towards Master, he would still just invite. He wouldn't threaten. He wouldn't demand. In the readings, I mentioned this idea of free will. I mean, if God never coerces, if he only invites, then we must be able to choose, right? Choose to accept his invitation or not. Choose many things. God says he is patient. He will wait, if necessary, for eternity till we we accept. So we have this free will. But we've made a lot of choices already, not only in this lifetime, but in past lives as well. And while we have free will, there may be some choices that we make that don't work. I mean, maybe I would love to be the next quarterback for the 49ers. But I think I passed that up at some point in the past, or an internationally renowned concert pianist. Well, let's see, 72, if I live to 100? Probably still not. I don't think that choice is open to me. I don't have that degree of free will. Lahiri Mahashaya says that we really only have one choice, or one set of choices. We can either love God or choose not to love God. Now, maybe another way that we can look at that is that when I'm getting ready to take my next step or my next move, or I come to that next little fork in the road, I can decide to either move in the direction where there's a little more light, or I can move in the direction where there's a little less light. That all by itself doesn't sound like I have a whole lot of free will. I've just got this little simple choice to make. And we pretty much, none of us here would just choose darkness, evil. This is the direction I'm going, as opposed to light, joy, eternal bliss. But that's rarely the choice. The choice that we have for our free will, that invitation is usually, okay, let's go a little more light direction, or where the light's a little less. And this applies not only to big decisions, which way we want to go, but even the little ones, because those are the ones we're making most of the time. I mean, we make big decisions every once in a while, but our life is mostly filled with small choices. When we're in the grocery store, what do we buy that we're going to eat that week? When we're getting ready to sit down and relax, am I going to read this book, or am I going to read that book? When we have some time for entertainment, which TV program am I going to watch? Or am I going to do something altogether different than watch TV? So we do have a lot of these small choices. One of the reasons I've been thinking about this recently is that I heard not too long ago an analogy that Ananda made about our life, what our life is like. And since it's our life, it's also about our spiritual path. And she said it's as though we are on a train. And the train has to follow the train tracks. The destination is clear because the train tracks are headed in a specific direction. And as we know, for our lives, eventually, they're really long train tracks, that's eternal bliss and merging again with God. And that's where the tracks are headed, but it is, for most of us, a long ways away. At least we can't see it from the side if we stick our head out the window of the train. But the choice that we have, not unlike Lahiri Mahashaya's, is that we can either move forward in the train or we can move back in the train. Not only moving forward gets us a little closer to that goal sooner, but at the front of the train, it's filled with light and it's filled with joy. Or at least that's what we've heard told to us. And the back of the train, all the way at the back of the train, the caboose, it's really dark and it's really evil. And really, all we are able to do is to move forward or to move backward. Now, when I first heard this idea, it did not fill me with joy and enthusiasm about my options, because I couldn't go any place except on the train track. And I revere Ananda Ma. I think she knew what she was talking about. So I tried to comprehend that. I guess the being the quarterback for the 49ers is way off the track. It's not on my track. And although she didn't say this, I have a feeling that we each have our own individual tracks. It's not like we are actually all on the very same track together, although we see each other and we talk and all, we may act like that, but we each have our own individual, unique track. So how was I going to deal with this idea that I'm thinking I'm so limited? And Ananda Ma says, it seems like so little choice. Well, I'm going to ask you to do an exercise that I picked up from Joe Tish, actually. I want you to close your eyes and try to sit just for 10 seconds, absolutely as still as you can, without moving. Don't move. Be completely stationary for 10 seconds. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you to evaluate yourself. There's going to be no show of hands. But I'm going to describe 4 categories, and mentally I want you to put yourself into one of those categories. I was completely immobile. I was stationary. I was still. I didn't move at all. My thoughts moved, but my body didn't move. I was right there. Or the next category is, well, I did pretty well, but I had to move this finger because it was going into a cramp, or some little motion that you had, but did pretty good, stayed pretty still. You were happy with yourself. Or I have to admit I moved some. I kept trying to go back to being still, but I moved some. Or finally, the 4th position, I was all over the place. I really wasn't ready for this. I didn't meditate this morning before I came to service. I came to service. I have to meditate before service too. But at any rate, I was really moving around. Okay. Now, if you thought that you were really still, you were not moving, you were stationary, or just moved a little bit, or moved some, then you're way off the mark. Maybe the person who felt he was all over the place was a little closer. Because here we are, you're sitting on a chair in the church in Palo Alto in California, on the planet Earth, that's going around the sun about 1,000 miles an hour. And not only were you moving 1,000 miles an hour, but this Earth is also, did I say going around the sun? I meant revolving on its axis, going 1,000 miles an hour, revolving on its axis, and it's going around the sun. It's going out around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour. Now, the whole solar system is not to be left out of this. It's also revolving around the galactic center at nearly 500,000 miles an hour. And then there's the galaxy, the Milky Way. That's a little tougher to judge speed at that level, but let's say against the radiation, the background radiation of the universe, it's moving about 1.2 million miles an hour. So there you were, completely controlling your movement, going nearly 2 million miles an hour. So I think maybe the 2 million miles an hour are all those possibilities outside my track. I can only move forward and back on my track, and you could only control the little bit of movement that you had relative to the seat you were in, relative to the person next to you maybe. So an awful lot of what we might want to do or we wish were true is completely outside our free will. And what we really need to be focused on all the time is what we can choose to do or not do, which is just moving forward in the train toward the light, trying not to slip back, fall back toward the back of the train. You know, sometimes conductors are on that train, thank God. And probably they're there because of our longing and our desire to move up to the front of the train a little faster. And they come by. And if we listen to them, they will tell us how to get up to the front of the train a little faster. They will invite us to do this or to do that. And we can make our forward movement much more quickly than we can if we ignore them. How wonderful our lives will be if we can always accept what we're offered by truth, by the great ones. If we were always living in a constant state of, RSVPing. Yes, I accept your invitation. I accept your invitation. I will be there. If we're always ready for that next invitation and always ready to respond. Yes.